a historian at UCLA for 15 years. Please welcome back to the program Dr. Roger McGrath. Roger, how are you? Roger, always nice to hear from you.
Yeah, thank you.
Roger, we wanted to put your article, Epidemic for the Record Books, up on LarryOda.com, but I guess you haven't published it yet. It's not yet linked to anything.
Well, yeah, the magazine, you've got a sneak preview there, Larry.
I see. Okay.
Yeah, the magazine's not out quite yet, so...
Okay, well, the magazine's called Chronicle, so look for it. The article is called Epidemic for the Record Books, and it's about the 1918 so-called Spanish flu. Roger McGrath, why do they call it the Spanish flu?
Well, it didn't originate in Spain. However, Spain was a neutral country during World War I, and that meant its journalists were not restricted by the strict censorship that the Allied countries, their journalists suffered under. And so the Spanish journalists began reporting the flu epidemic in their own country, which was ravaging Spain. And they also reported on the number of Allied troops hospitalized, and dying from the flu in France. And so we began to hear about this as this flu in Spain through the Spanish journalists, and thus the name.
Mm-hmm. Roger McGrath, how bad was the 1918 flu pandemic, and how does it compare with the current pandemic?
Well, if you want a real flu pandemic, then go back to 1918, 1919, because it took millions worldwide. But here in the United States, with a population of less than one-third of what we have today, mm-hmm. It took 675,000 lives. And I don't know the current count, but even if it gets to 100,000, which has been tossed around, which I think is extravagant, I'll be surprised if it gets to 50,000 lives. 50,000 would be 1/40th of it proportionally mm-hmm. of what the Spanish flu took, and even 100,000 would be 1/20th of what the Spanish flu took. And the Spanish flu took it all in about 3 months. There's a few cases. Most of it went in about 6 weeks, October 1918 to mid-November. There were some in September, and then a few later in November and December, and then some in the later in the winter in January, February of 1919, and mm-hmm. a few into March. Mm-hmm. But the bulk of them came in about a 6-week period. Thousands died. 12,000 died in 6 weeks in Philadelphia, for example. And if you'd have to say 36,000 in 6 weeks today. And we're seeing nothing at all like that. In fact, thus far, we're not even seeing this equal our regular seasonal flu. And of course, this greatly bothers me because it's a hysterical reaction to this, media generated, I would say.
Well, Roger, let's talk about the reaction. What did state and local governments do in 1918?
Well, this is of greatest interest because it varied greatly. There was no national effort. This was principally a local effort, and so then they varied. And you'd see some cities took all sorts of precautions and quarantine and closings, and other cities did nothing, and the differences were nil. Mm-hmm. Some of the cities that had the very lowest death rates did very little about it. You had other cities order their citizens to wear masks, which did nothing, but they thought it might have some positive effect. And closed down certain areas and businesses and closed schools. And it really seems to have made no difference one way or the other. It's simply the contagion spread through the population. and taking the young, by the way, and sparing the old. And so it's theorized that the older people had experienced similar viruses in the 19th century and had antibodies that gave them some immunity, because you didn't see very many old people die from this. It was mostly people in their late teens, 20s, and 30s.
I'm talking to historian Roger McGrath. He has a piece in a publication called Chronicles called Epidemic for the Record Books. It's about the 1918 flu pandemic. Roger, they were debating about the effectiveness of masks back then, over 100 years ago, just as they are right now.
Yeah, that's right, and it's unlikely that they do much. They may do something about these droplets containing the virus landing on surfaces and then somebody touching the surfaces, but some kind of airborne transmission is probably highly unlikely. And also, there has to be a certain amount of concentration of the virus. Mm-hmm. Okay, you can touch something or some droplets have the virus, but it's not enough. Mm-hmm. Your immune system overcomes it. It has to be a certain concentration. And that's why we're seeing, I think the latest I heard from the deaths in Southern California, 80% of them were of people over 65 years old with compromised immune systems.
Mm-hmm. Roger McGrath, we have just 1 minute left. What would you do differently than what Trump is doing?
Well, I certainly would leave quarantine and shuttering these businesses as an option.